As Detention, I went through the hardest days of my life. I'm still suffering from severe trauma. They held me naked, and soldiers set dogs on me that attacked me. They beat me on a penis, tied it with a plastic cord, and caused swelling and bleeding.
Israeli forces detained a Palestinian man we're calling SS in March 2024. They sent him to the notorious Detention military prison, known for its brutality and torture of Palestinian detainees. SS is one of thousands of Palestinians detained by Israeli forces since October 2023. Human rights groups estimate that at least 21,000 have been arrested in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem, with thousands more taken from Gaza. They say many have experienced severe abuse while in Israeli custody: beatings, starvation, sexual violence, rape. Israeli authorities deny this, but testimonies collected by rights groups, UN investigators, and Palestinian and Israeli lawyers raise serious questions about what is really happening inside Israeli prisons, detention centers, and other holding facilities. In an exclusive interview with Al Jazeera, UN Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese spoke about the findings of her latest report, Torture and Genocide, ahead of presenting it to the United Nations Human Rights Council on March 23rd.
When I say that torture in Palestine has become part of the Israeli posture toward them, I'm not being hyperbolic. When you see rabbis inciting to commit heinous acts such as violence, sexual violence, and torture, when you have a national parliament debating and defending the right to torture Palestinians, when you see soldiers really taking pride and making fun of mistreating another life, another human being, it's a portrayal of the moral decay of that society.
You may have seen some of the images she's talking about on social media, but the real story behind comments like these is much darker. A warning: what you're about to see and hear may be disturbing. Let's take a look at where, according to testimonies and investigations by human rights groups like Adamir and B'Tselem, these atrocities are happening. This map shows just how many Israeli prisons and detention centers there are, stretching from the Negev desert to prisons inside Israel to military detention sites in the occupied West Bank. In some cases, satellite images also show the expansion of detention sites since October 2023, which have increasingly become the focus of growing international scrutiny. We'll start with the Detention military detention facility. Situated in the Negev, near the border with the occupied Gaza Strip, it looks like any other Israeli military base. Concrete walls, watchtowers, fences crowned with barbed wire. But since October 2023, there's been an increasing number of Palestinians held here saying they've been beaten, sexually assaulted, and tortured.
Brutality has escalated to an unprecedented level after October 7. It has become vindictive. It has become really part of the staple menu of the custodial practices.
A February 2026 report by the Committee to Protect Journalists documented the treatment of Palestinian reporters detained by Israeli forces. The CPJ interviewed 59 journalists from Gaza who had been released from Israeli detention between October 2023 and January 2026. 20 of them had been held here, in Detention, for all or part of their detention. Of the 59 journalists, all but one said they had been subjected to torture, sexual assault, or other violence while in custody. One former detainee, Osama Sayed, said he and other prisoners were forced to strip naked and were then sexually assaulted by trained military dogs inside Detention. He described the dog attack as rape, saying soldiers laughed and recorded the sexual assault. Another former detainee who asked to remain anonymous said soldiers cut off the blood flow to his genitals using plastic zip ties and beat him so severely that he could not urinate without passing blood. He said Israeli soldiers told him that once they were through, he would no longer be a man. And then there's Offer Prison in the occupied West Bank. Of the 59 journalists interviewed in the CPJ report, 30 were held here, including Mohammed al-Atrash. In November 2023, he says he and dozens of other prisoners were subjected to a coordinated assault, what he describes as mass punishment. He says guards unleashed trained dogs to attack them, while they were beaten with metal rods to inflict wounds intended to cause prolonged bleeding and scars. Accounts like these appear repeatedly across survivor testimonies. We've also been speaking to Palestinian and Israeli rights groups that document these cases. Based on survivor testimony and Israeli whistleblowers, Palestinian detainees held in Israeli military bases, police stations, detention centers, and prisons were subjected to the following: severe beatings, stress positions, prolonged shackling, denial of food and medical care, and sexual assault. We're now going to talk about allegations that involve sexual violence and the deliberate targeting of detainees' genitals. We poured through survivor testimonies and interviews with human rights groups. They describe a pattern of abuse that includes forced nudity during interrogations, beatings focused on genitals, threats of rape, and in many cases, sexual assault. And investigators, including the UN Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese, say these assaults go beyond sexual crimes. In many cases, it's sexualized torture, abuse meant to dominate and punish detainees.
Sexual violence has served a specific purpose. It's brutal if it's used against women or men. It doesn't differentiate. But the way it's been used against men, it really gives the idea of wanting to break the spirit of these people so that they do not procreate anymore.
Torture of Palestinian detainees is not new. Human rights organizations have been documenting allegations of torture in Israeli detention from before the early 2000s, even after the 1999 Israeli Supreme Court ruling. In that case, the court's decision was meant to limit the use of moderate physical pressure during interrogations, but it still allowed for exceptions whenever necessity dictated. Since October 2023, the scale and severity of these allegations of torture have increased sharply.
Nothing of this is really new. Not the torture, not the brutal methods, not what is different and what is new is the scale, the intensity, and the sadism with which these acts are perpetrated, these crimes are committed.
What's more, many of these allegations of abuse involve facilities where Palestinians are held under something called administrative detention, meaning without charge or trial. That's where serious legal questions begin to emerge. And while administrative detention may be legally murkier, torture is explicitly illegal under international law, primarily through the UN Convention Against Torture. It's a rule with no exceptions. Not in wartime, not in an emergency, not under orders. And yet, allegations of torture by Israeli authorities continue to surface, often linked to the same detention facilities repeatedly described in detainee testimony. These testimonies suggest that it's not just one or two prisons, it's a network. And the use of torture by Israeli soldiers and other authorities across these institutions suggests it is not simply the result of individual misconduct or rogue soldiers. It's systematic.
I've also used statements by whistleblowers who have been collected in Israel. And when you put together, they totally corroborate what Palestinian former detainees and their lawyers say. But again, it cannot be reduced to one man or one person only, because as I document throughout my report, there is an entire nation that was aware that torture was inflicted. There are doctors who have seen the signs of torture. There are doctors who have supervised the fact that while detained, these people were severely abused and raped.
In her report, Albanese describes a system of torture and sexual violence that, she says, may amount to genocide. Part of this systemic pattern of abuse is the level of immunity Israeli soldiers appear to enjoy. Accountability for abuse in Israeli detention is almost non-existent. Around 1,300 complaints of torture were submitted to Israel's Justice Ministry between 2001 and 2020. Only a handful resulted in criminal investigations, and none led to indictments. Like in a Sidi Temin case, a leaked video from July 5, 2024 appears to show Israeli soldiers isolating a Palestinian detainee, shielding him from view, and carrying out a violent sexual assault. The suspects were detained and investigated by Israeli authorities before the video surfaced, with the footage emerging days later, in early August, amid backlash following the soldiers' arrests. Yifat Tomer Yerushalmi, an Israeli major general at the time, said she leaked the video to debunk claims by people on the far right, who said that the abuse at Sidi Temin was fabricated. On March 12, 2026, the Israeli Military Prosecutor's Office dropped the case, citing insufficient evidence. The soldiers were hailed as heroes. The only person to suffer consequences was Yafet. She resigned after leaking the video. She was arrested on charges including fraud, breach of trust, and obstruction of justice, and could face jail time. Cases like these start to raise bigger questions about how allegations of abuse against Palestinian detainees are actually talked about inside Israel. And they point to something else too: oversight. Because when there are almost no prosecutions, it raises the question of whether this is being allowed to continue. These findings are based on the testimonies of the survivors who were released from detention. There are still more than 9,500 Palestinians in custody. Taken together, these accounts suggest this isn't isolated. They point to a pattern across sites over time. The question is no longer whether abuse is happening, but what that pattern says about the system behind it.